Hey kids, welcome back to another exciting, no, a special episode of No Subs, No Dubs. We're going to call this a special episode of No Subs, No Dubs because this is like a bi-week episode. Baka Boy was saying a housekeeping episode, keeping house. I think bi-week episode, I don't know what we're going to call it exactly, what we're going to title this episode. But it's just a little break every 10 episodes or so. I think every 10th episode, what we're going to do is just have one of these little chats. One of these fireside chats, right? Where we don't talk about a foreign film. The main show is I watch an international film in its native or whatever language they decide to put in it. As their speaking language, right? And I try to figure out what the heck's going on. But every 10th episode now, it's just going to be me talking about stuff. This is exciting, Baka Boy. So if you want to skip this one, go ahead. It might take another week before you get another episode in. But there's some lessons learned, right? There's some figuring out what we're going to do for the future. And maybe a look back or something of that nature. I'm not quite sure. I was just kind of sitting here thinking about what to talk about. And what kind of came to my mind this time is maybe what's the journey to finding a podcast or finding podcasts, and why do people like them? And my journey specifically, Baka Boy does not enjoy podcasts. He does the editing, and he kind of tells me what to do and what to watch and whatnot. And then he listens to this and he cuts out all the ums and uhs and whatnot, and then puts the thing at the end and compresses the audio so it doesn't sound totally like crap for your guys' viewing experience. Listening experience. Baka Boy, cut that out. Cut all that out and make me look sound intelligent for once, please. Yeah, so coughing up there a little bit. We were discussing. I was thinking about talking about my journey, my experience, and not much of a journey. It was more when I was younger. Podcasts just started coming out, right? And my dad listened to the Ricky Gervais. I think he watched on HBO first, and they had their animated, HBO show where they basically just make fun of Carl Pilkington. That's that's their premise, that's the niche, right? Him niching down was just him and his buddy making fun of Carl, which was... It's just ridiculous. So I remember kind of being around for that, but not really into it. And then I was in school, and my dad's like, you probably need to know history. You got to be smarter, kid. Why don't you take a listen? Why don't you take a listen to this guy? He doesn't sound like that. Why don't you listen to this guy, Dan Carlin? So Dan Carlin was my first introduction to podcasts. And it was hardcore history. And I think there must have been 10 episodes then, or 8 or something like that. So I listened to all of them as quickly as possible. It was fascinating. I like the way he does his podcast. I still really enjoy them, even if they're extremely long, but they're still really good. And that was my first introduction. That's the one. And I also listened to his political podcast, and this isn't a political podcast. No Subs, No Dubs doesn't have anything really to do with politics, but I enjoyed Common Sense with Dan Carlin. I listened to that more, and I think it was because there was more of them. Hardcore History is really good, and they got to the point where they're really long, and so it would be a marathon listening to Hardcore History. And then listening to Common Sense was these shorter, albeit fairly long episodes in themselves. I think 40 minutes, 50, sometimes shorter, but for the most part, pretty decent length. And I just wanted to listen to Dan Carlin, more and more of his stuff. So I listened to Common Sense as well. And then I think the third one that I really got into was Skeptic's Guide to the Galaxy, or Universe. So one of those, right? I don't want to look it up now. Maybe we'll cut around it. Baka Boy will find, I'll just say Universe, Galaxy, and then we'll find out which one it actually is. But the Skeptic's Guide was one of those early on ones that I listened to a lot. And then another one that I listened to back then, and I still listen to quite frequently, is the Classic Tales podcast. So the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe is one of those shows where it's like 5 people always talking back and forth, and they talk about like skeptical stuff. And Dan Carlin was always a one person talking. One of those one person podcasts that's really good. Which, if you're listening to this and you want to listen to a one person podcast, that's good. Dan Carlin, go that route, right? You might actually learn something. And he would talk history and politics, and then Skeptic's Guide would talk about like science and stuff like that, and all those interesting other things that, like, they're obviously skeptics of, with ghosts and goblins, and saying no ghosts, no goblins, right? So I sort of grew up on those podcasts. But the other one was Classic Tales, and Classic Tales is one of these. He's got such a calming voice. He'll read these, he'll perform them, really, is what he does, is he performs these classic tales from, these great stories, these great short stories, sometimes even longer stories in parts. And he's got such a good voice with it that it kind of lulled me into a sense of like, what was going on, And then I'd be like, oh, I need to rewind this like a minute so I know what's going on. It's a good podcast, but it's one of those, like, for me, I really got to pay attention. So I still listen to it, usually on a run. And the last time I was listening to it, I went for a run, and I had to skip back like 10 minutes to be like, I kind of just zoned out because it was so rhythmic listening to that podcast. And that's one of those things. So those are the early stuff. I still listen to podcasts all the time, but that's kind of the stuff that built into me an appreciation of podcasts. And those are a cream of the crop, like your high standard podcasts. This is a low standard that hopefully will build up. And that's what every like 10th episode will look back and will say, did it build up a little bit? Maybe. I don't know. I know that when I'm watching these films without understanding what's going on, I realize that a lot of times in my notes, because I take notes while I'm doing it, a lot of times in my notes, I just get to like, this was strange or weird, and it seems like there's a strangeness and a weirdness, and I was talking to Baka Boy, I was talking to B, and he was like, you gotta have a better vocabulary than just that. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm thinking about pulling out a thesaurus for these next ones and just changing the word but meaning the same thing. Maybe that's an idea for the future. I don't know. That might be a funny way to go about it. I know I'm taking a lot of notes, and I'm thinking about shortening them a little bit. I'm just going a little bit more on the fly. I was wondering about, like, just maybe not taking notes and trying it from memory, the scene by scene, but the scene by scene from memory just doesn't seem like it'll be easy at all. It's already hard enough to pay attention, write notes, pause it, write notes, like, am I scribbling while I'm watching, then pausing it every once in a while when I have to write a whole bunch of notes at once, and then going back at it, so that kind of makes it difficult as well. Maybe I'll try an episode where I just watch it like flat out, and then just try to explain what happens, but I don't know if it'll have that scene by scene sort of situation going on. One of the things that I was thinking about is it cheating if I've seen the movie before and it's a foreign film, and I've seen it with the subtitles when I was younger, but I haven't seen it in a long time? That's a question, because I know some of these movies that are very popular, like Pan's Labyrinth, for instance, I know I've seen that. I think I've seen that a couple of times. At least twice, for sure. Maybe even 3 times. But it's been years, and quite frankly, I remember the images and whatnot, and there's some, like, really creepy images, and I know it's all about Spain and war, I think. Like Franco, remember that guy? Maybe around that time, or World War II or something. But I don't know, like, the whole gist of it. I know she gets ginger or something. The little girl gets some ginger and puts it under the bed, and it's supposed to make sure her mom's pregnancy works out or something. So I don't feel like that's cheating, is me going back to that one, because my memory of it is just to that point and the ending, but I kind of remember the ending. But everything else, like what they talk about and all that stuff, that's not in my head. And I wonder about that too. If you watch it with subtitles, even if it's a really good movie and it means something to you, is it going to stick in your head as much as a good movie that means something to you in your native language? That's a quandary, right? Do you forget the stuff because you read it and you had to go through like 2 things at once? You had to read it and then listen to it, and it's in some sort of different language that you don't know, and you had to read it and you had to comprehend what was going on. I'm not completely sure. So I think Pan's Labyrinth might be one that I do in the future. I've got a list of movies that I should be watching, and one of the things that we're going to try to do is have some older movies, some newer movies kind of situation. Some classics or older crappy movies, like the one movie these last 9 that were interesting was, I watched 8½, and that's a classic. That's a really good movie, apparently, but I've never seen it before. So when I watched it, I was like, okay, well, this is a lot of talking. It was good for the most part, and it has moments that stick with me, but it was like, all right. And then The Funny Colonel, right? I watched that. There's a French movie, and I didn't know anything about it. And, Baka Boy looked it up later and was like, no, this movie has a very poor rating. And I was like, oh, it's just old. It's just one of these old movies. So I don't know if we should do classics or just all kinds of old movies, even the bad ones, right? And that one wasn't very good at all. And there's some, I think out of these first 9, the one I enjoyed the most is still Train to Busan. That was fun. Train to Busan was probably the most fun movie. I thought All Quiet on the Western Front was really good. It was not, like, pleasant. As I'm laughing. It was not pleasant to watch, some parts of it, but it was a really good movie. But Train to Busan was much more fun. And then I thought I was going to, like, let the right one in more, but looking back at it now, it's like, that was just, that's when I knew, like, the source, right? It was weird. And then you get the other ones. You got the one from Mexico. That was kind of like, okay, this was, I got what they were going for, but it was kind of mid-tier. You know what I mean? And then the last movie was just horrible. Just not a very good movie. So I'm trying to think about what we do in the future. I think Pan's Labyrinth might come about. There might be some other ones. We're looking at Babel, Bollywood. Definitely need to go in there. Babel is like English for a bit of it, but I don't feel like that's kind of cheating. That seems foreign language for the most part. And I think I might have seen part of it, but I don't remember. It didn't look interesting, so I think that one would be fine to do. I'll have to look into some other ones. So you can look ahead to those. I'll have to put them on the docket. I'll put them in the queue for the future movies that I struggled through watching. And maybe one of those I'll just like free ball it, as it were. No notes. Just go in and be like, all right, maybe that's what I do on the next one, is just a free ball situation, and we'll see if that even works. What I was reading is you need notes, but maybe not as many notes as I've been taking, because that seems to be almost a hindrance right now. But yeah, that's like the first part of my journey, rewinding backward. My so-called journey of listening to podcasts was those. And then there's something for the future. And then I guess I'd have to say, like, what really got me into wanting to do a podcast, was listening to another podcast I started listening to, which is Drunk Ex-Pastors. And they do this call-in thing, where you can call in, you can leave a voicemail, right? So I leave all these voicemails. I used to call in quite frequently, like constantly just calling in, trying to do different voices. I'd do Trump, I'd go, let's see, on the spot. I go, okay, it's me, it's capital T, I do Trump, and I try to do other voices. And they did a couple of Trump voicemails that they play on, and they did like 2 more or 3 from me of different voices. So I just call them with all these different like voices that I'd be trying out and whatnot. And at a certain point, I was like, well, I like hearing myself do these voices. Why not just, sit down, get a mic, and just sit here and do something, right? And I think that's all it takes, is you get out there and you kind of grind and you see what happens. So they ended up playing a voicemail of mine a couple of their podcasts ago, where they ended up giving me kind of a shout out to let me plug this. No subs, no dubs. Let me plug this whole thing and discussing foreign films. And I don't know if this will ever get back to him, but that was the podcast. It didn't really build my interest in hearing podcasts. That was way before. But it built my interest in podcasting, their podcast, which I've been a faithful listener, and I hope you guys check it out sometime. We got a plan moving forward. Is the point. And this might be a bye-week situation. Every 10 episodes, there's a bye week. I was like, you take a break, talk for 20 minutes, and then get back in the game. Watch another one of these foreign flicks. Just, all right, put something on that's in Hebrew or whatever, and be like, okay, don't know what's going on, but they all seem Jewish. They all seem like they're Hebrew because they speak it, right? So that's the level of critique you're going to get from this podcast, is me being like, oh, they're Russian, they're Russian in. And that's the level of comedy you're going to get from this podcast, is they're Russian in. It's not good. It's not bad, but it's not good. It's somewhere in between bad and good. Mediocre. Hopefully improves a little bit. I was looking online, and it's like, you got to do 50 podcasts before you get somewhat of a decent audience. And even my mom's like, your art is bad. I don't want to listen to it. Your art is bad. I'm like, well, I'm not an artist. You should hire an artist. I am not rich. Oh, you should get good at art. Well, you can listen to it and give me a critique there. And she's like, no, just your art is bad. Need to watch a movie. Anyway, I'm out of here. Casey Kidd. I didn't even frickin' introduce. See, this is why bye weeks are bad. There was no planning. There's no planning on it. Anyway, I'm Casey Kidd, the Kamikaze Kid, blowing up all over this bitch. Take it away, baka boy. Hey, that should be at the end of it. My art is bad, and then fade out. Maybe this stays in the practice realm. Maybe this is a special episode.